So when you think about adventure, I know that that is a very loaded term because that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I think specifically with study abroad in mind, that, as I mentioned in the longer form video from last week, where I talked about the fact that overall, the total number of study abroad students prior to 2020 was still very low. Overall, it marks around 25% to 35%, depending on, kind of what data you're looking at as a total of the amount of students worldwide that study abroad. And then as you dive deeper into other countries, like here in the US, where it's like 10 to 12% of students study abroad, you're still in a really exclusive club. And so we talked about in that video, if you haven't seen it, go ahead and click the link down below. But we talked about, how it just sort of shows people that you're willing to kind of get out there and try something new. And so I think that that's a really important piece to kind of play up, not necessarily even if you are sort of actually saying that, like, well, I want it to be risky. And so I, spent 3 months in Bali. Like, that's not, I mean, that could be considered risky, but it's more or less about the fact that you are showing that you were interested in taking a risk. Because I think a lot of times people don't think about the fact that it can be a risk to study abroad. And so, not just from a sort of a perspective of like safety and things like that. Yes, depending on where you're going, it could be more risky than other places, but you need to use your common sense no matter where you're traveling. But I think it's more or less about the fact that depending on what your current situation is, it can be risky to sort of want to embark on that. Because, for example, in previous videos, I talked about the fact that there are some students, particularly here in the United States, but there are other countries that you will find this as well, where they only have the opportunity to study abroad with their university or their college, which I do not agree with at all. Obviously that makes sense because I did not do that, but I did not do that because I felt, boxed in by my college. They were so supportive of me and I'm very grateful for that. But it was more or less the fact that, like, I'm a huge champion of freedom in that way, of being able to make your own decisions for what you think is your best path, and to sort of tell a student, not so much. I mean, there are some schools, that, I mean, it's part of their job, right? So schools, colleges, universities, they are basically businesses. They are organizations, listed as organizations, but they're basically businesses. And so it is in their best interest if you spend your money with them. That's right. Obviously, that makes sense. As a business owner, I get that. But I think that there's a fine line. In fact, maybe it's not even really that fine. There's a straight line between, sort of telling the student, well, like, maybe you should consider doing, XYZ's program over this independent program. That's one thing. We can have that conversation. But a lot of schools have it written in their contract, or will just flat out not allow students to, study abroad if it's not going to be with their college or their university. I do not support that. I think that that needs to be handled in some way, and that a lot of people should have more confidence to sort of speak out about that, because it sort of limits people. Like, suppose that your school doesn't offer what you're interested in a country that you want to go. You're just limited to that, or you can't do it. I think that that's really ridiculous. And I would not be a part of any school that was definitely going to be sort of telling me that, or anything else that I did not agree with. Not that, you have to agree with everything your school does, but particularly here in the US, if you're paying $45,000 a year, you're going to have what I want to do, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And if I'm not going to be able to do it, then I'm out of there. Anyway, so I think that it's really important to sort of think about that in terms of, it is risky, because I've actually worked with a lot of students who, and this is not really surprising if you've been on my channel a while, who I tend to like attract a lot of rebels who are like, as I just said before, like, they're like, well, I'm actually just going to do this anyway. But that can be risky, right? Because they, could risk the potential of, maybe have spent 3 months abroad and not being able to use those credits. And in some instances, that doesn't matter for students. They're like, I really just wanted to go spend a semester, maybe a summer semester, or I wanted to take time off and go somewhere and, spend it in Switzerland or whatever. And my school was not up for that, but I wanted to do this. So I did it. And, maybe I'm going to have to graduate an extra year later because I, have to still get more credits because I wasn't able to apply them. But they were just fine with doing it. So I think that that can be a risk. And again, that's more on the extreme side. That is not every single college or university, but there are a lot of them out there just in the world in general. But also too, there's lots of other types of risk of, just, I know that I keep kind of talking about it, but I definitely am going to dive deeper into sort of the emotional side of study abroad, and that can be a risk for a lot of people depending on kind of where you're coming from in terms of your sort of emotional stability, or how comfortable you feel with maybe traveling or being on your own, being away from family. That's also a risk as well. And so I think that that's another way that you can sort of convey maybe something that you've overcome. I know that there's quite a few students that I have advised in the past. If you've not heard about my advising sessions, click in the description below. But there are have been students in the past that I've advised who they've actually used sort of their struggles with homesickness to talk about that in an interview. And I know that you would say, well, why would you bring up something like that in an interview that makes you look weak? But they used it as sort of showing a strength of like overcoming, which is definitely not a weakness. Again, there's nothing that you can be better at in an interview than being genuine. And so if you actually talk about, hey, this is something I actually went through, but then you're showing the steps of this is how I overcame it. This is the steps that I took and then it got better. You can definitely use something like that in an interview for anything that you're doing. And so I definitely think that that is something where, you're showing that you took a risk, even though you knew that you were a person who didn't do well with, kind of being away from family, being away from friends, but you still want to get out there and do it. I think that's very important. And so for this last bonus tip for this video, I just wanted to kind of talk about the fact that if you're looking for ways to improve your career, you definitely have it in study abroad when you're thinking about international work opportunities. And so that kind of goes back to the last video as well, where I was talking about how you want to start building up those relationships while you're abroad. And you definitely want to sort of lean into that, from an international work opportunity or any other type of international opportunity that you may have in your career. Once you kind of open that door, it's there. And so, maybe it's going to be something where you're like me, like once you finished your degree, you just got lucky and were able to find a job in your host country, stay there for a while. Maybe it's something where you're going to get to work for a company that has an international office. And because you have all this experience, you're already familiar with the culture. They're like, oh yeah, like they'd be great to like, go and stay there for 6 months and help us like build up this new product. You never know like what type of opportunities are out there. And so that's why I always say that you definitely want to make sure that people know that you have studied abroad and that it's, been impactful for you and that it's something that fits in well with your career and whatever you're doing so that you can be considered for those opportunities. I really feel like depending on whatever field you're in or whatever you may be studying right now, that there are so many different types of opportunity. There's tons of, particularly in like the medical field and things like that. Obviously, as we know, there's so many volunteer opportunities, particularly in third world countries or in other countries where maybe their healthcare system is not, sort of on the first rate scale, if you will. And so there's lots of different opportunities to do that. And even though it may not be a paid position, it's still something like in the future that you could do because you're in that field and people thought about you. I know that, a lot of us have probably heard about the fact that there's so many kids who get a chance to go abroad and teach different languages, or they get to actually just teach in general in different countries. And so there's so much out there, and a lot of that stems from having a door open when you first studied abroad. And so if you were able to, as I mentioned before, keep that door open, cultivate, I can't even talk today, cultivate those relationships, as you're going, make it genuine. Don't just reach out to people when you need something, make it genuine, just check in on them. And then, it's just going to give you even more opportunities in the future. And I am so excited to hear about it. I know that for me, it was great to be able to experience that. And now in the position that I am, I get to sort of help people sort of shape that for themselves. And so I look forward to hearing from you about how that's going to work for you once you get those international opportunities. So I will see you on the next video.